Okay, today is November 5th, 15th, 2014. Okay, we'll begin 3 times with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning everybody. Okay, today we will be taking Sutta number 121 in the Majjhima Nikāya. This is called the Culasunnata Sutta, which Venerable Nyanamoli translated as the shorter discourse on voidness. You have to remember he translated this in the 1950s, so maybe at that time the word voidness was being generally selected as a rendering for sunyata, but a competitor was sort of running alongside of it, which has now gained prominence, and that is emptiness. So actually, if I were revising this now, I would have replaced voidness by emptiness. And I think this sutta and a number of other suttas show sometimes it's believed that the idea of sunyata, or emptiness, was an innovation of the Mahayana, particularly the Prajnaparamita Sutras, and everybody, or at least many people, know the Heart Sutra. Form is not different from emptiness, emptiness is not different from form. But actually the idea of emptiness, which becomes so prominent during the early period of Mahayana Buddhism, or actually through the whole history of Mahayana Buddhism, actually has its roots in the early teachings, in which it's not so prominent as in the Prajnaparamita literature, but in places here and there one finds the Buddha is already introducing the idea of emptiness. In fact, we have a kind of fixed set of items which are considered like the 3 types of samadhi that culminate in liberation of the mind. And these 3 are called the samadhi of signlessness, the samadhi of wishlessness, desirelessness, and then the 3rd is the samadhi of emptiness. And it seems to me, this is a little bit of a speculation, but it just occurred to me when looking at the sutta again, that the Buddha might have proposed the idea of emptiness as something of a response to, or like a counterweight to, the philosophy of the Upanishads. The Upanishads is the last part of the Vedas, the Vedic literature, and the Upanishads are considered the culmination of the Vedic philosophical heritage. And of course the Upanishads provide the foundation for all of the later philosophical systems of what comes to be called Hinduism, the so-called orthodox philosophical systems. And one of the key hymns in the Upanishads, it's a very beautiful hymn, Purnam Adda Purnam Idang Purnat Purnam udachyate, purnasya purnam adaya, purnam eva vishyate. I memorized it this morning. Don't think that I have a photographic memory. Okay, so it means purnam adah. This is full. Or that is full. Purnam idam. This is full. And the next, purnat purnam udachyate. From fullness, fullness arises. Purnat, I have to check my script. Purnasya purnam adaya, purnam eva avashishyate. So that is full, this is full. From fullness, fullness comes. Having taken fullness away from fullness, what remains is fullness. So the meaning of this, I think the way the commentaries would explain it, the Vedic or the Upanishadic or Vedanta commentaries, that is full is referring to the ultimate reality, the absolute or Brahman. This is the absolute unconditioned reality of the Vedantic philosophy. And then that is full, that's Brahman, the ultimate absolute reality is complete or full in itself, infinite. Purnam idam, this is full, this is the manifest reality, that is all, the whole phenomenal world. Then purnat purnam udachyate. From fullness, fullness emerges. That is, this whole phenomenal world, which itself is full, emerges from the fullness of Brahman, from the absolute reality. And then purnasya purnam adaya, that is, if one takes away the entire phenomenal world, the entire world of manifestation, through the state of liberation, purnam eva avashishyate, fullness itself remains. That is, you take away the whole world of manifestation, and what is left is still the absolute, still the ultimate reality. So the ultimate reality is the source of the entire manifest world. The manifest world is a full manifestation of the absolute, and yet when one removes the manifest world, the world of name and form, what remains is still the absolute, the ultimate Brahman. Okay, so the Upanishads are working with the idea of fullness, and the fullness is the Brahman. And so the Buddha, in many respects, he develops his teaching as a kind of critique of Brahmanism. And so instead of using the idea of fullness what the Buddha takes as sort of the antidote to the idea of fullness is the idea of sunyata, emptiness. So instead of saying that the world is full, the world is complete, the Buddha says that the world is empty. Sunyam lokam, sunyam lokam. And there's a sutta, it occurs in the Samyutta Nikāya, in the Salayatana Samyutta. This is the chapter 35 on the 6 sense bases, where I think it's chapter 35, it could be sutta number 85, somewhere around there, 85, 86, 87. Ananda comes to the Buddha and he says, Bhante, it's said, sunyam lokam, the world is empty. The world is empty. In what sense is the world empty? And then the Buddha replies that the world is empty of a self and of anything belonging to a self. Atana sunyang, atanava sunyang, ataniyena va sunyang. It's empty of a self or of anything pertaining to a self. Therefore the world is empty. And then the Buddha goes on to explain, to elaborate on that statement, and he says that the I is empty of a self or anything that belongs to a self. Forms are empty of a self or what belongs to a self. The ear, nose, tongue, body, mind is empty of a self and of anything belonging to a self. And so for the Upanishads, the ultimate reality, Brahman, is identical with the innermost reality of the living being, which is called Atman. And Atman in Pali is Atta, the self. And so for the Upanishads, everything is a manifestation of the self, and the innermost self is identical with that reality which lies behind the whole manifest world, which is that ultimate, absolute reality is Brahman. And so for the Upanishads, Brahman equals Atman equals all of this, the world. Okay, so we set up a kind of contrast between the philosophy of the Upanishads and the philosophy of the Buddha. So for the Upanishads, we have the ultimate reality, the absolute, is Brahman, and Brahman that's the source of the universe, the absolute behind the universe, which is identical with Atman, and everything in the world is a manifestation of Brahman Atman. So all this, the world is full because it's all an expression or manifestation of the fullness of Brahman. So the Buddha sort of set up the contrast by taking emptiness as his fundamental standpoint. And so when you apply emptiness to the inner self, so to speak, or to the person turns out to be anatta, without any inherent Atman, any kind of permanent, substantial, everlasting self. And all of this, everything in the world, is empty. It's both empty, and to say that it's empty means precisely that it's empty of a self or of anything belonging to a self. But now in early Buddhism, the idea of emptiness seems to be used in two ways, at least two ways. Or maybe we could even say three. Well, I'm starting to think of four ways. But let us just, to keep it simple, stick to two ways. One way is on the side of developing what is called samatha, or serenity meditation. The other pertains to developing wisdom, or insight meditation. That is vipassana and or panya. And it seems that in the shorter discourse on emptiness, the emphasis, as we'll see, is on the development of samatha, using the idea of emptiness as a way to progress in the sequential quieting or calming of the mind and elevating the mind to higher levels, progressively higher levels of samadhi. Okay, so let us now take a look at the sutta. Okay, so the sutta takes place when the Buddha is living in Savatthi, in the palace or the mansion of Megara's mother. And then one evening, the Venerable Ananda, after spending the day in meditation, he comes to the Buddha and he says to the Buddha, "Venerable Sir, on one occasion, the Blessed One was living in the Sakyan country at a town of the Sakyans named Nagarika. And there I heard, and I learned this from the Blessed One's own lips. Now, Ananda, I often abide in voidness." And it's interesting now, Ananda seems puzzled by that. Well, let us say, let's use emptiness. I often abide in emptiness. And it seems that Ananda may have been puzzled by that. It was something he didn't understand, because the idea of abiding in emptiness would have been something incomprehensible to him. And so he asked the Buddha, did I hear that correctly? Did I learn that correctly? Did I attend to that correctly? Did I remember that correctly? He might have thought that the Buddha said one thing. Maybe he thought the Buddha said, I abide in fullness, like a good Upanishadic yogi. But the Buddha abiding in emptiness, if it's emptiness, there's nothing there. So how could you abide in that? And I don't know where this sutta might have come from, where the Buddha says, I often abide in emptiness. But there is a sutta in the Majjhima Nikāya. This is Sutta 151 on page 1143, if you have the book with you. In this case, Sariputta comes to the Buddha and pays homage to him. Then the Buddha says to Sariputta, he says, your faculties are clear. Your complexion excuse me. Okay, he says, your faculties are clear, the color of your skin is pure and bright. How do you often abide now, Sariputta? Then Sariputta says, I often abide in voidness. Then the Buddha praises Sariputta and says, good Sariputta, you often abide in the abiding of a great man. For this is the abiding of a great man, namely emptiness. And so maybe it was this statement, though it's a little different from the one quoted by Ananda, but it seems to be similar in tone. In this sutta, Ananda is quoting the Buddha as him saying that he himself often abides in emptiness. Okay, so then when Ananda questions the Buddha says, you heard that correctly, you learned that correctly, as formerly, so now too, I often abide in emptiness. So this is the Buddha's dwelling place, you could say, that the Buddha abides in emptiness. That is the dwelling place of the Tathagata. Okay, and now in section 4, the Buddha is going to start to explain to Ananda how one enters gradually, step by step, into what is called the pure, undistorted, abiding in emptiness. And so he starts off by drawing his attention to the place where they're living. This is the palace, it's not a palace, it's a mansion, a multi-story building of Migara's mother. So he says this mansion of Migara's mother is empty of elephants, cattle, horses, and mares, empty of gold and silver, empty of the assembly of men and women, and there is present only this non-voidness. then he uses an interesting expression, the singleness dependent on the sangha of bhikkhus. The word singleness is ekata, or oneness. It signifies a kind of uniformity. So you could see that like all of the monks are probably assembled in maybe the ground floor of the mansion. It's probably like a lecture hall. And so they're all sitting there, and all of the other things that the Buddha mentions, the hall is empty of. But there is just this uniformity of the community of bhikkhus who are there. Okay, so now the Buddha is going to take that as an analogy to show how one starts developing the meditation on emptiness. So he says, so too a monk not attending to the perception of a village, not attending to the perception of people, attends to the singleness dependent on the perception of forest. And so now one is sort of emptying the mind of any kind of idea of people, perception of people, but one is attending just to the uniformity in the forest, which is the object of perception. So when one looks out at the forest, particularly, I guess this would be in this particular season in India, where the trees are all full of leaves, and so one will see just like a mass of green, maybe different shades of green, different trees, and one just focuses upon that uniformity of the forest, but the forest which is empty of a village, empty of people, empty of all the commotions that take place when people get together, and so one will be obtaining quite a kind of peaceful, quiet, calming, uniform, or perception of the uniformity of the forest. Okay, when that perception arises, then, the Buddha says, his mind enters into the perception of forest and acquires confidence. I think a better rendering for that word, pasada, here would be serenity, placidity, steadiness, and resolution. In other words, one is now focusing upon the perception of forest, and the mind is quieting down and becoming stabilized simply on the idea of forest. Okay, so now one has a uniform perception which is quieting the mind, and the mind is stabilized and made steady on this perception of forest. Okay, so now he goes on to examine that perception in this way, as explained. He understands thus: whatever disturbances there might be dependent on the perception of village, those are not present here. Whatever disturbances there might be dependent on the perception of people, those are not present here. There is present only this amount of disturbance, namely the singleness or uniformity dependent on the perception of forest. And here the key word is dharita. We don't need this anymore. Anybody still need this? Here, you take this one. And the other word. Yeah, the word ekata means oneness. Literally, it's oneness. The Venerable Nyanamoli translates it as singleness. I would sort of explain it as uniformity. And then the word dharita is what is rendered as disturbance. But maybe disturbance, it's too strong. I don't know a better word, a word which captures the subtlety of this. It doesn't, like when we hear the word disturbance, we think of maybe on the 4th of July, kids are throwing firecrackers, or there's a big crowd gathering outside. Or we think of going into a supermarket on a Saturday when everybody has gone shopping. That's the real disturbance. But this is just like some kind of, it can be just like very little subtle ripplings that upset the perfect placidity, tranquility, sereneness of the mind. Yeah, I think of it as sort of like little wavelets on the surface of a lake. Okay, so he thinks that there's only this amount, this mere disturbance that is the uniformity dependent on the perception of forest. Okay, now the perception of forest serves to make the mind calm. Oh, wait, let me just continue. I've overshot the mark. Okay, now he understands this field of perception is empty of the perception of village. This field of perception is empty of the perception of people. There is present only this non-emptiness, this of which it is not empty, namely the singleness or uniformity of the perception of forest. And then comes very important sentence. He says, thus he regards it as empty of what is not there. So the field of perception is empty of the perception of village. It's empty of the perception of people. So it's empty of what is not there. But as to what remains there, he understands that which is present thus. This is present. So what remains there is this uniformity dependent on the perception of forest. And he understands this is present. And then the Buddha says, thus, Ananda, This is his genuine, undistorted, pure descent into emptiness. I want us to try a little experiment. What we're going to do, just in 2 minutes, first, just you sit for 1 minute, just take whatever meditation object you usually use. You could use the breath, focusing the in and out breathing. Then when I hit this, turn the attention to the room and just think of the room as it is, full of people. Then when I hit this a second time, drop the idea of people here and just focus on the room, the space of the room without the people. Just see if you can get even a flash of a perception of emptiness. It's not intended to be like a 2-minute path to enlightenment, but just to get that, if you get a little taste of the sense of emptiness. Okay, first when I hit it, that'll be 3 times actually. The first time you just focus on, say, mindfulness of breathing. Second time, you turn to the attention. Don't open your eyes, keep the eyes closed, but consider the room as filled with people. Then the third time I hit it, just reflect or focus on the empty aspect of the room as a space, but without considering the people in the room. You now consider the room filled with people, tables, chairs, and so on. You now remove all the people and objects from your perception. Just let the perception rest on the space in the room. Do you get a sense of spaciousness suddenly opening up? If you don't worry about it. It takes practice. Yeah.
The difficulty is that I would get the feeling, and then I would remember the don't think of a white elephant. It was a struggle.
Yeah, that's why.
Don't think of the people.
That's why the Buddha uses the expression, how does he put it? That the mind has to acquire, I call it serenity, steadiness, and resolution. I mean, initially the mind it's starting to get it, then I'm not supposed to focus on it, and then, there's a bit of a struggle. But it's a gradual process of sort of clarifying the perception of, in this case, the emptiness of the room. The room is being empty of or that one's perception is being emptied of people, desks, tables, chairs, and other objects. Okay, so now we have the monk who is being described as just focusing on, in this case, the perception of forest. And I said that this sentence is very important, that he regards it as empty of what is not there, but of what remains there he understands that which is present, thus this is present. Because this is the key to the gradual, genuine, undistorted, pure descent into emptiness. One focuses upon what is present there, and then one has to, in succession, eliminate that which is present by choosing successively more subtle objects. Okay, so the Buddha continues. Okay, he says, again, Ananda, a monk, not attending to the perception of people, not attending to the perception of forests, attends to the singleness dependent on the perception of earth. His mind enters into that perception of earth and acquires confidence, steadiness, and resolution. Okay, so now the reason why the Buddha recommends moving from the perception of forest to the perception of earth is because the perception of forest itself can't serve, or generally, probably for most people, can't serve as an adequate basis for developing higher states of samadhi or deep concentration. For that one needs a uniform object. And probably what is meant by the earth here would not be something like we look on the ground here. It's not thinking of the whole planet Earth, or not even like looking at the ground with patches of grass, fallen leaves, stones. Of course, there's a lot of variety in that. But this is using a section of earth as a basis for developing focused concentration in order to attain the jhanas. And one way this is done within the meditative tradition of early Buddhism is by creating a meditation object which is called a kasina. A kasina is usually, it's a circular, well, it's a disc course the disc is circular, maybe about this big, which is prepared by meditators, and then the disc is taken to represent sometimes one of the four elements, sometimes a particular color. So there's the earth kasina, the water kasina, the fire kasina, and the air kasina. And of these four, the easiest is the earth kasina. Then the four color kasinas are the blue, red, yellow, and white. So that would just be a circular disc in which the inside is painted either a uniform blue color or red, yellow, or white. The earth kasina is a disc which is filled with clay or soil. Well, clay is the easiest to use, reddish-brown clay, and then made extremely smooth and even. And the meditator puts the disc in front at a convenient distance and then focuses upon that object, just thinking, earth, 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 and letting the eyes, sort of half-closed eyes, rest upon the appearance of the earth in the kasina until the meditator can get a mental picture of the earth kasina, a very clear mental picture, and then he can stop focusing upon the outer kasina and just focus upon the mental idea of earth, earth, earth. Generally, one will have to go through a period of alternating with closed eyes and open eyes until one can get a very clear, distinct mental perception of earth. And then one just focuses upon the mental perception, and then as the faculties mature, then the mind becomes absorbed into that mental image of earth, and then gradually samadhi arises. Here the Buddha is not specifying the actual creation of the kasina, but maybe the meditator will go to an area where the ground is smooth and of a uniform color, without, stones, rocks, fallen leaves, patches of grass, because that would break up the uniformity. Okay, so the Buddha uses a simile to illustrate how that perception of earth has to be obtained. He says, just as a bull's hide becomes free from folds when fully stretched with 100 pegs. So this would have been a simile that would have been clear to the people of that particular time. Here probably we don't see leather workers working, so we don't have a clear idea of this. But if you think of a rubber, or maybe think of a tent. What is that kind of rubber that they stretch out on the ground? Tarp, a tarp, that's it, yeah. A rubber tarp, which when you take the sheet of rubber, it's all folded up and creased, but you spread it on the ground, and then if you use pegs to stretch it out, all of the folds and creases and the rubber vanish, and you just have a smooth rubber surface. Okay, so in this way, the Buddha says, the monk not attending to any of the ridges and hollows of this earth, to the rivers and ravines, the tracks of stumps and thorns, the mountains and uneven places, that tends to the singleness dependent on the perception of earth. His mind then enters into that perception of earth and acquires serenity, steadiness, and resolution. Okay, so now, presumably, the way I would understand this, the meditator is now able to gain samadhi, even jhana, on the basis of focusing on the earth, perhaps even probably going through the 4 jhanas. Okay, the text continues, whatever disturbances there might be dependent on the perception of people, those are not present here. Whatever disturbances there might be dependent on the perception of forests, those are not present here. Those are not present here. So that earlier, the perception of forest was considered subtle, and the perception of the village and of people was gross or coarse. And so he used the perception of forest to overcome the disturbances based on the perception of people. But now, at this point, even the perception of forest is considered gross or a bit disturbing. And so he has to overcome the perception of forest, and he does this by focusing upon the perception of earth. So whatever disturbances there might be dependent on the perception of forest, those are not present here. There is present only this amount of disturbance, that is the singleness or uniformity dependent on the perception of earth. So now he's going to understand this in terms of emptiness. So he understands this field of perception is empty of the perception of people. This field of perception is empty of the perception of forest. There is present only this non-emptiness, only this of which it is not empty, namely the singleness or the uniformity dependent on the perception of earth. Thus, he regards it as empty of what is not there. What is not there? Yeah, perception of... Wait, this is the perception of earth. Right. So, what's absent is perception of people and perception of forest. But as to what remains there, he understands that which is present thus. This is present. So what is present there? Yeah, not earth, but perception of earth. Of course, the earth is present as the object, but since this is a process of subjective refinement, the focus is not on the external object, but on the perception of that object. So what is present is the perception of earth. So the perception of earth is initially subtle compared to the perception of forest. But now it's said that the perception of earth is even presents some degree of disturbance that's present there. Okay, so then the Buddha says, this too is his genuine, undistorted, pure descent into voidness. And as I said, in my interpretation, when the Buddha is speaking about the perception of earth, you can see this from the next section, where the Buddha jumps to the perception of the base of infinite space, which is the first of the 4 formless meditative attainments. So that seems to imply that the monk, the meditating monk, has achieved, in the previous section, has achieved the 4 jhanas. And those would be 4 jhanas based on the perception of earth. 4 jhanas with the earth as the object of the jhanic experience. Okay, so now, maybe I should ask at this point whether there's any questions. It's a pretty difficult sutta, or at least experientially it's difficult. Any questions? Yes, please.
Yes.
Wait, take the microphone so it gets recorded.
Thank you. Is this something that we could expect to realize in a certain amount of time? I know that's a difficult question, but when I've asked other people about jhanic meditation and formless meditation, some people say it's just so difficult to even realize as a layperson, and other people say it is possible depending on your faculties. I wonder what you feel about that.
It all depends on the person's faculties. They're not easy attainments, but some people have mature faculties, probably, I would say, from practice in previous lives, or just through very diligent effort over a long period of time in this life alone. And so they're able to achieve this. And what I found interestingly, even though it's said that, the monk's life is supposed to be like the ideal condition for achieving the jhanas, but I've heard of lay people, lay practitioners, who achieve the jhanas. Well, most monks don't achieve them. So it depends very much on the personal aptitude, previous effort in earlier lives, so that a person will have a disposition towards that, sort of the imprints, and very diligent effort. But if one is intent on the jhanic attainments, one shouldn't, in America we're used to, 6 months I will get you to be turned from a 98-pound weakling into a strong man, or for a diet plan, 6 weeks you can go from 300 pounds to 180 pounds, or, well, some, quote, Buddhist teachers teach weekend enlightenment courses. And sometimes I haven't seen it in a long time, but I used to see on the column that you get on on Gmail, somebody advertising, I'll have you meditating like a Zen master in 6 weeks. So we're used to getting everything quickly, but practicing the Dharma, it's a gradual process, and if one practices rightly with dedication, one makes gradual progress. Any other questions? Okay, Jering?
The states of so-called emptiness we're talking over here is only an experience, right, Bhante? In other words, what I mean is, if an ordinary being, they have an experience of emptiness.
Yeah.
It could be only a moment or two.
Yeah.
But it is not for, you don't get it once and you don't, it's not forever, right, those experiences?
Of course, there are many different understandings of emptiness. I'll just try to stick to what is being explained here. This is the way in which the monk or the meditator is examining his experience, using the idea of emptiness as a kind of filter or template for examining the experience. And so one is examining the experience to see what is that experience is empty of, and to see what is still present there as a kind of incentive for bringing the meditative development to a still higher or deeper level. And so one sees that it's empty of certain things means that those things are absent in the experience. What is still present there is said to be a degree of disturbance, darita matta. And so since one is aiming to reach deeper stages of tranquilization, then one has to progress to the next level in order to eliminate that factor that is causing that degree of disturbance. Yeah, so that's the way emptiness is being explained here. So it's not so much a realization in the sense of some kind of enlightenment experience, but it's more a seeing and examining the meditative state in terms of what has been eliminated in that state and what is still present there and causing some degree of disturbance. David, please take the microphone.
This sounds like the removal of layers of perception.
Yeah, that's a very good analogy to use. It's like sort of peeling off.
Peeling things off, like in I don't know, you probably don't know Photoshop. It's a photo editing process. But what you can do is remove layers of the image until there's nothing left. You know, just a gray field. So I assume it's something similar to that.
Yeah, in fact, I remember even with the one that I've used, Picasa, when you want to sort of doctor up the image, even if you start off with a black and white photo, but nowadays all the photos are colored, but you could do things like change the lighting, change the shading, strengthen the colors, mellow the colors, and then you get one image, but then you decide, I like the original better. So then you click cancel the mellowing of the image, cancel the brightening of the colors, cancel the intensification of the shading, cancel the change of the lighting, and then you get the original image. Amelia?
What I see here is that we are single-pointedly focused on an object. In this particular case, it's the earth.
Yeah.
Can it be any object that you feel you can focus on even clearer than that?
I would say so, definitely so. Yeah, it's just that the earth is chosen here. I mean, the Buddha had to choose some object.
Right.
And probably, of course, they're sitting in this building and they see the forest, and so instead of focusing upon the forest, instead of focusing upon all the trees in the forest, which the trees have variety, so focusing upon the earth, particularly the way the Buddha explains it, a uniform stretch, a uniform track of the earth, then you get this greater uniformity.
So once that disturbance of the perception of the earth is gone, would you say that's the point where you get to the jhanas?
No, I'd say that the meditator is developing the jhanas based on the perception of the earth. So the earth is now the object of the jhanas. So this is like, especially in the system of the Visuddhimagga, the earth kasina can be the object of the four jhanas. If one doesn't want the earth, actually something like the surface of water could be used as an object, especially on a windless day, so that the water is very smooth without waves. Or one could use, I mentioned the other kasinas, would be like the blue kasina, red kasina, just a circular disc of a uniform, absolutely uniform color. Okay, let us continue. Okay, so now we're going to go beyond the perception of earth And we'll see this is why I think the perception of earth is intended implicitly to include the 4 jhanas, the 4 meditative absorptions. Because the Buddha continues that the monk, now not attending to the perception of forest, not attending to the perception of earth, attends to the singleness or uniformity dependent on the base of infinite space, or the base of the infinity of space. His mind enters into that perception of the base of infinite space and acquires serenity, steadiness, and resolution. Okay, now the way this is done, according to the way it's explained in the commentaries, suppose when the meditator has achieved the jhana based on the perception of earth, using the earth kasina. And so first one has to master that meditation in various ways. It's not that you just attain it for a few minutes and then one is ready to go on to the next stage. But one has to enter into it repeatedly so that one could enter into it whenever one wants to without any struggle. One has to get very familiar with that perception. Okay, and so one has the earth object. It's no longer a visible patch of earth, but it's the mentally visualized earth as the object of the meditation. And now to go to the base of infinite space, what one has to do is to start extending or expanding the circle of earth that one is perceiving in one's meditation, the sphere of earth. One expands it more and more widely until the whole field of perception is covered with the perception of earth, or till the manifestation of earth covers the whole field of perception. So that in front of one, to the sides, above one, and even seemingly behind one, everything is covered with earth, the uniform color of the earth. Then one has to gradually make the determination to remove the appearance of earth. And then as one's effort gains momentum, at a certain point, the field of earth perception drops away, and what remains when the earth is removed is just the space that the perception of earth had been occupying. And since the perception of earth has been expanded infinitely, the space that remains when the idea of earth is removed is infinite space. And so that marks the attainment of the first formless or non-material meditative attainment. Okay, so now he understands whatever disturbances there might be dependent on the perception of forest, those are not present here. Whatever disturbances there might be dependent on the perception of earth, those are not present here. So now, he's not even mentioning the village or people anymore, because those are sort of been left behind long ago. So now even the perception of forest and the perception of earth, those have vanished. But there is present only this amount of disturbance, namely the singleness dependent on the perception of the base of infinite space. Okay, now he applies the idea of emptiness to this, and he understands the field of perception is empty of the perception of forest. This field of perception is empty of the perception of earth. There is present only this non-emptiness, this which is not empty, namely the singleness or uniformity dependent on the perception of the base of infinite space. Okay, so he regards it as empty of what is not there. What is empty? What is not there? Perception of and forest. Perception of forest, perception of earth, and what remains there? Right, the perception of the base of infinite space. Okay, so this is his genuine, undistorted, pure descent into emptiness. Okay, I'm going to just jump over the next sections. So the next, just taking the main theme, the next section applies this to attaining the base of infinite consciousness. Then we go to the base of nothingness. Then section 9 to the base of neither perception nor non-perception. Okay, then we come to section 10. And here we have a new item introduced, something which is not found so often in the suttas. Okay, so following the text, again Ananda, the monk, not attending to the perception of the base of nothingness, not attending to the base of perception of the base of neither perception nor non-perception, attends to the singleness, uniformity, dependent on the signless concentration of mind. His mind enters into that signless concentration and acquires confidence, steadiness, and resolution upon that. And what is called the signless concentration of mind in Pali, this is the animitta ceto samadhi. And many different interpretations have been given to this expression in many different commentaries and different schools of Buddhism. But the way it's understood, or the way it's explained in the Pali commentaries, is that this is the deep concentration that arises not through the process of samatha meditation, but through the process of vipassana, insight meditation. Often we think of samadhi and vipassana as somewhat opposed to each other, but actually as the meditator is developing insight, the mind is becoming progressively more concentrated, more focused upon the object. So the object of insight meditation is always changing. And it's said that when the mind develops deep meditative concentration on the characteristic of impermanence, then that samadhi is called the signless or markless concentration of mind. And it's called the signless meditation because one is contemplating phenomena from which the mark or sign of stability, lastingness, or permanence has been stripped away. And so one is seeing continuously with unbroken attention the constant arising and passing away of phenomena. And so it said that his mind enters into that signless concentration of mind, and then whatever disturbances there might be dependent on the perception of the base of nothingness, those are not present. Whatever disturbances there might be dependent on the perception of the base of neither perception nor non-perception, those are not present here. What is present is only this amount of disturbance, namely that connected with the 6 sense bases that are dependent on this body and conditioned by life, by the life faculty. Okay, so then he understands that the field of perception is void of the base of nothingness, the base of neither perception nor non-perception. He understands that what is present are these 6 bases dependent on the body, the 6 sense bases: eyes, ears, nose, tongue, the sense of touch, the mind faculty, and conditioned by life. Okay, now the next stage, repeats the same, it starts off repeating the same sentences. Okay, so the monk, not attending to the perception of the base of nothingness, the base of neither perception nor non-perception, attends to the singleness dependent on the signless concentration of mind. He then enters into that signless concentration, acquires serenity, steadiness, and resolution. Okay, now he's going to contemplate that meditative state itself with insight. And he sees that this signless concentration of mind itself is conditioned and a product of volition. In other words, there's a tendency amongst meditators to grasp upon very deep meditative experiences as being some kind of disclosure of the absolute self, the unconditioned self, or the absolute reality. But now the meditator here turns the beam of awareness. He's been contemplating the impermanence of all other phenomena, and so his mind has become deeply absorbed in this contemplation, this concentrated contemplation of impermanence of all phenomena. But now he turns the beam of awareness back upon that concentration itself and understands that this signless concentration itself arises through conditions, particularly all of the effort that is invested in obtaining that concentration of mind. And so it's a product of volition. The text says it's something abhisankaritam, abhisanchetaitam. It's something abhisankatam, abhisanchetaitam. Something produced by conditions, by having undertaken all of the preparations, having gone through all the initial stages, having made the effort, the endeavor to attain it. And then one realizes that whatever is conditioned and produced by volition is impermanent, subject to cessation. So even that signless concentration of mind, because it's created by conditions, when those conditions are removed, that signless concentration comes to an end. And so one is getting now a radical insight into impermanence, that even this concentration of mind is something produced through the chain, through a network or web of conditions. And because it's produced by conditions, when those conditions are removed, then that signless concentration of mind comes to an end. So it's subject to cessation. And then when he knows and sees thus, his mind is liberated from the taint of sensual desire. That's from the asava, the deep underlying defilement of sensual craving, liberated from the taint of craving for continued existence, liberated from the taint, the asava of ignorance. And then he understands birth is destroyed, the holy life has been lived, what had to be done has been done. There is no more coming to any state of being. So this marks the attainment of arahatship through contemplating the conditioned and impermanent nature of the signless concentration of mind. At this point, now I'll ask whether there's any questions. As I said, this goes into very deep territory, so don't be...
I'm still stuck with this word descent.
Let us say, maybe it's using the image of going towards deeper and deeper states.
Well, because even you use the word higher states.
Yeah. I'm using higher. Okay, so the problem is, so he says that he has difficulty understanding the use of the word descent. These are just sort of metaphorical words. If we speak about going into deeper and deeper states, then we say that one is descending into emptiness. One could change the metaphor and say one is ascending to higher and higher states. One can say that one is moving to higher and higher states, then one would use the metaphor of ascending rather than descending. If we want to use a neutral term, we could say entering into deeper states or entering into higher states. Progressing, yeah. Richard?
Is the word base used in the beginning of the phrase for each of the four formless meditations? Because the base was originally the kasina in the first four meditative states, and each of the subsequent ones are replacing the kasina with something else, and so that's why they're bases. Is always the base of infinite space, the base of...
I think so. I think in the sense, the sense could be in the sense that they're objects for meditation. In fact, technically, the word kasina is sort of the commonly used shorthand, but the more sort of fuller expression is actually kasinayatana. And the word ayatana that's joined to kasina is the same word that's used in relation to, say, the base of infinite space is akasananchayatana. Infinite consciousness, vinyananchayatana. So you see, it's the same, the second part of the compound is the same word. So probably in the sense of something that serves as the object of support for the meditative mind.
Because what the kasina is conceptualized as being initially is earth, right? And then each of the others is replacing it, right? And so that's why that's the concept, right?
Yeah, I would say so, yeah.
Overall, it strikes me that what's really being eliminated is attachment, is desire, right? How why is there the assumption that the elimination of desire, or attachment, there's a desire for continued being and so on, and all of that, is equivalent to being free of rebirth or no longer coming back? Where does that assumption come from?
Can you bring that question up again when we have the discussion period after the lunch break? Because that's sort of like a big question. We just have like 5 minutes and I want to finish the sutta. Okay, so he says, now we're progressing to paragraph 12. So he says, whatever disturbances there might be dependent on the taint, or actually I prefer now asava, influx of sensual desire, those are not present here. Whatever disturbances there might be dependent on the asava of craving for existence, those are not present here. Whatever disturbances there might be dependent on the asava of ignorance, those are not present here. There is present only this amount of disturbance, that connected with the 6 sense bases, dependent on the body, and conditioned by life. So I think at this point, this is referring to what is called the nibbana element with a residue remaining. The residue is the complex of bodily and mental experience, or the complex of body and mind, the 5 aggregates that the Arahat still maintains through the course of his life. And so that is some degree of disturbance, since through the 6 sense faculties, one is still subject to the disturbance, sort of the natural disturbances of pleasant sensations, painful sensations, hunger, thirst, injury, physical illness, and so forth. And so that remains, but he understands that this field of perception is void of the 3 asavas of sensual craving, craving for existence, and craving and ignorance. And there is present only this which is not empty, that connected with the 6 sense bases, dependent on this body, and conditioned by life. And so he regards it as empty of what is not there, but as to what remains, he understands this is present. And then the Buddha concludes the main portion of the exposition. He says, this is his genuine, undistorted, pure descent into emptiness, supreme and unsurpassed. I think he uses the expressions parama anuttara. And so the commentary then explains that this is referring to what's called the Arahat's fruition attainment of emptiness. This is a special meditative attainment into which the Buddhas and the Arahats can enter while alive. They enter into a samadhi that takes nibbana as its object of experience. And one could focus upon nibbana in different ways. So the 3 ways in which one could enter absorption into nibbana are as the signless, the desireless, and as emptiness. So in this case, he's referring to the entry into the fruition meditation of arhatship, which focuses upon nibbana in the aspect of emptiness. And then the Buddha, in a way, in a sense, highlighting the significance of this discourse. He says that whatever ascetics and Brahmins in the past entered upon and dwelt in pure, supreme, unsurpassed emptiness, all entered and dwelt in this same pure, supreme, unsurpassed emptiness. And so for all those ascetics and Brahmins in the future, and whatever ascetics and Brahmins at present enter and dwell in pure, supreme, unsurpassed emptiness, all enter and dwell in this same pure, supreme, unsurpassed emptiness. And then since Ananda is still in training, the Buddha says you should train thus. We will enter upon and dwell in pure, supreme, unsurpassed emptiness. Okay, and that takes us to the end of the sutta. I won't take questions now, but please do come back after the lunch break. We'll start at 12:30, and so we could take some questions that time. And we'll give priority to Richard, since he had a question for this session. Okay, and we'll have a class again next week. Next week we come into the greater discourse on emptiness. Don't throw your eyes up to the ceiling. So it's called greater discourse. Greater actually means longer. They're called Chula and Maha on the basis of length. Not necessarily that one is more boring than the other, or more difficult than the other. Okay, so let us end with the sharing of the merits. May all the devas, nagas, bhutas enter upon this pure, supreme, unsurpassed dwelling in emptiness. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva shirang rakantu sasanam. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva shirang rakantu desanam. Akasata chabumata Deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya Etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya pavagupadaya vichihitato etantare satakayupapanna rupya rupicha asanya sanino dukkha pamuchantu Pusantu sunyatam. Okay. We'll end with 3 bows or half bows to the Buddha.
Prabhupada.
Okay, we can take questions, and I said Richard would have the first chance. Do you have the other microphone? Oh, is it this that they're using? Yeah, somebody show him how to put it on. I think you have to, let me see it. I think you have to open the inner, I'll do it, let me see. Yeah, you turn it on the inside. There's a button to press here. That's the on-off switch. This is the mute and sound switch. No, then you have to get the actual microphone. Anyway, you have a strong voice.
All right. If I re-ask my question, let me preface it this way. Okay. In the symposium, Plato has Socrates.
Okay.
Okay. Plato has Socrates pictured speaking about love. Everyone else at the symposium has already spoken. They've all given great praises to gods and goddesses of love. Except for Aristophanes, who's a much subtler guy, and much more interesting. Anyway, when it's Socrates' turn, he says, "Oh no, that's not true. Love isn't this wonderful creature. Love, in fact, is very ugly. Is a dwarfish character, and is in constant pain because of all of the lack that he feels. That is, love is an absence of, of all this stuff. And so he then has the ladder of love that his Diotima told him about, right? And he describes, how to come to love the world and all of that. And the thing is, it's the assumption of the whole thing is that it's in positive terms. That is, he sees love as an absence. That's a lack, an emptiness. And when love gets gradually filled up by learning to love better and more things and so on, then, the world becomes its full self, sort of in the Upanishad sense. Okay? Now, the Buddha reverses this. He says, okay, we're going to go after emptiness.
Yeah.
And we want to get rid of all these layers of the plenum of fullness and all of that. And so once emptiness is the positive thing, in a sense, the desire not to have anything, which is, by the way, something they actually agree about. There's a fundamental agreement there between Plato, Socrates, and the Buddha, in that desire is seen as a form of suffering.
Yeah.
It's an absence, okay? Yeah. But then the Buddhist solution is to regard fullness and existence as a negative thing. And he seems you get rid of these layers of existence, and what you're left with is really parallel to what you're left with at the end of Socrates' speech, which is where, you feel equanimity towards everything and magnanimity towards everything. Except he's reversed the polarity. But what I'm asking is, why does the Buddha assume that when you lose desire, that is an attachment to things, that then you lose existence also? Why is the loss of desire for existence equivalent to the loss of existence? Because there's an odd mismatch between those two sets of concepts, right? I mean, they're viewed, the implications are entirely different. And somehow I'm wondering where does the assumption come from that if you lose the desire, you lose the thing?
Okay. I think I have to unpack your question or parse it in certain ways. First of all, the word that I'm rendering as existence is the Pali word bhava. And this word signifies, I call this a concrete state of existence in any of the different realms of existence recognized in the Buddhist cosmology. So bhava would be a concrete state of existence that will begin with conception or origination into that realm, and which terminates in death or passing away. Okay, so according to the Buddha, any particular individual existence is a bhava. So right now we have our bhava as human beings in the human realm. And what the Buddha teaches is that through time without beginning, we have been going through a continual repetition of existence. And this repetition of existence is what's called puna bhava. So puna means again. Existence, repeated existence. So we go through this cycle or this succession of existences through time without beginning, again and again taking birth, beginning actually with conception, coming through birth, growth, aging, and death. And so, in a sense, this is the problem that the Buddha faced when he went on his quest for enlightenment. And because this whole cycle of repeated existence involves again and again going through old age, illness, death, and then meeting with disagreeable experiences, sorrow, grief, displeasure, dejection, pain, and so forth, it all becomes qualified as dukkha, which doesn't mean, despite the common translation, simply as suffering, but it means what is unsatisfactory, deficient, inadequate, defective. And so then the Buddha inquires, this was sort of what he was looking for in his quest, what is the underlying cause of puna bhava? What is it that maintains this cycle of birth and death over and over? And then the Buddha comes to the conclusion that it's the craving for, especially the craving for existence, which then inquiring what sustains that craving, he takes it to be avidya, ignorance or unknowing, not knowing, not understanding, the true nature of things. Okay, so within the Buddha's scheme of liberation, the antidote to ignorance is vijja, or correct knowledge, correct understanding, insight, which is to be arrived at through cultivating panya, wisdom. And then when wisdom arises, then avidya is overcome. And with the overcoming of, because what panya, what one sees with wisdom, is at least one thing that one sees, is the unsatisfactory nature of punabhava, of conditioned existence, repeated existence. And so when that realization becomes deep enough, then it eliminates the craving for continued existence. And so that puts an end to, because the craving for new existence has been eliminated, then there's no more, there is no more craving for new existence. And so when the craving for existence is eliminated, then the stream of consciousness at death no longer grasps after a new mode of existence, and then that brings to an end the cycle of repeated existence. Okay, but the insight that existence is dukkha, the elimination of craving, doesn't immediately bring the end of existence, in the sense that the one who's awakened or enlightened still continues to live out the normal lifespan. Did that get to the question?
Well, it doesn't persuade me. I have reasons for not being persuaded. But it still seems to me.
Wait, take the microphone, so.
It seems to me to be a paradoxical form of wish fulfillment. Saying, well, if you no longer crave existence, well, then you won't exist anymore. Which isn't that wish fulfillment? That if you assume existence is dukkha, right, it's suffering, then, okay, so you conclude, all right, you don't want to suffer anymore, you don't want to exist anymore, well, you won't exist. Isn't that wish fulfillment? It's assuming that the wish and the thing are, that the wish is what affects the thing. That you, if you do not wish for existence, you won't exist. And there's no immediate proof of this, because you go on existing until you lead, have a normal lifespan and all that. Yeah. And so the whole thing is kind of hypothetical. It's built on doctrine. It's saying, well, after your normal lifespan, you would normally be reborn. Yeah. But there's no evidence of that really to be presented.
Yeah, I mean, it's not sort of the task of the Buddha in the Discourses to be trying to argue, in the sense of trying to argue to impose an acceptance of rebirth on people, apart from his authority as a teacher.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, so within the Discourses themselves, one won't find empirically based arguments for rebirth. First, let me deal with the issue of wish fulfillment. Let's take it from an internal perspective, an internal Buddhist perspective. One can't say that it's simply a matter of wish fulfillment, since it's not enough simply to wish to be free from the cycle of rebirth. I mean, somebody might be sitting and saying, I wish to be free from samsara, from the cycle of punabhava, from the cycle of repeated existence. But just by wishing, one is not going to get there. In order to get there, one has to cultivate, the Noble Eightfold Path. And so that's a quite rigorous course of practice that one has to go through.
Yeah, but it's just saying, okay, so there are shallow wishes and deep wishes, and this is a deep wish.
Well,
when you come to the end of your deep wish for existence, you then are freed from existence. But it's still the assumption that the dependence, that the thing, the existence of the thing or the phenomenon or state of mind is dependent upon the deep wish, right? That is,
No,
it's,
I
it's
wouldn't say that.
desire for existence that gives you repeated existence.
What I say is that the Buddha's scheme of liberation is dependent upon, let's say, the premise or assumption that there is rebirth in some form, that consciousness continues beyond death and takes on new incarnations, new embodiments in different realms of existence within this. Maybe you don't even have to accept the cosmology in all of its details, but within a cosmos that allows for consciousness to continue in other forms. And then also the corollary of this premise is that the form of existence that one takes is determined by one's ethically significant actions, which are one's karma.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are premises of the system, definitely, I would say, which I, as a Buddhist, I accept this on trust from the Buddha, since the Buddha says these are things that he's seen and realized for himself. The night of his enlightenment, he saw his own past lives, as well as with the divine eye, he saw how beings pass away and take rebirth in good and bad states, depending on their volitional actions. So these are things that, first, within the discourses themselves and even the commentaries, there's no arguments presented for rebirth. It's just laid out, this is what the Buddha teaches based on his own experiences, and then the whole tradition pretty much accepts this, since it's flowing from the Buddha, as being authoritative. It's not presented like, I would say, I wouldn't call it like a dogma in the sense that you have to believe this in order to be saved. If you don't believe this, you're going to be punished eternally in hell or anything like that. But these are like the foundational beliefs of Buddhism or the Buddha's teaching. When we step out of the inner domain of the teaching, and then look at the premise of rebirth, then looking at it objectively, I don't think one could present any kind of rational argument that will establish rebirth as a necessary truth, even though some of the later Buddhist philosophers in India, Dignaga, I think Dharmakirti, tried to develop a logical proof of rebirth, and now the Tibetans, particularly the Gelugpas who study Dharmakirti, use Dharmakirti's arguments that it's necessary in order for consciousness to arise, it has to arise from a cause which is of the same nature as itself. And since the only thing which is of the same nature as consciousness is a prior moment of consciousness, therefore the first moment of consciousness at conception must have been preceded by a moment of consciousness before conception, that is, the consciousness from another life. Therefore, we prove that rebirth is true. But
it's like an ontological proof.
Yeah, I mean, it can be easy to undermine that argument in various ways. So, for myself, I just accept rebirth on the basis of the Buddha's teaching. But if one wants to look at it empirically, there are cases that I've mentioned previously, or researchers who have investigated reported cases of rebirth. And you could look at these for yourself and decide how rigorous the evidence is. The one who did the most research on this, I think starting from the 1950s, 60s, through a good part of the 1980s, was Professor Ian Stevenson, who is in the Faculty of Medicine at University of Virginia. He has, maybe his most general book is called 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. Then he has a number of more specialized studies in this area. And then I think he has somebody at the University of Virginia now has continued his type of research. I don't remember the name.
Well, it's not so much the empirical evidence, it's the assumption that the desire is that you remove the desire, you remove the thing desired for, which strikes me as very similar to the objections to Heidegger's being in time, saying, well, he's caught in this
Objections to what? I didn't catch it.
The objections to Heidegger's being in time.
Oh, to Heidegger's being in time.
Yeah, saying, he's saying, well, okay, he can make a way to metaphysics here, and what lots of readers are saying is, no, you can't, because you're assuming that the description of a state of mind is equivalent to the description of reality. Right? And this is the same kind of thing. It's saying, well, the description of, as you have the desire, then the existence is going to follow the desire.
Yeah.
That's a basically subjective premise.
Yeah, I mean, that's the premise.
Right, and that's what strikes me as saying, well, that's why it seems to me it's really primarily backed up by the authority of the Buddha.
Yeah.
And right, so it's an argument for most people. It's an argument from authority because the relevant personal experience is the Buddha's personal experience.
Okay.
It's not the personal experience of the rest of us because we're not qualified to have that experience. It's assumed his experience is far more valid than ours because he's a far better person than we are. And it's like, here, look, he was an accurate perceiver of other people who always said the right thing at the right time and persuaded, thousands of people and all of that. And a great man, and we're not.
Okay, let me just make one comment, and I think we have to give some other people a chance to ask questions. Even though the Buddha teaches rebirth on the basis of his own sort of experience, his own realization, from the Buddha's text we see it's not considered to be a realization which is unique to the Buddha himself, but those who follow his teaching and use the appropriate methods are able to recollect their own past lives and to see the process of birth, of death and rebirth operating in the case of others. Of course, you could raise the objection, and it's quite a valid one. Okay, these who are following in the Buddha's footsteps, these are not like objective scientists coming with white coats and, coming in from the blue, but these so-called confirmers are wearing ochre or saffron-colored robes, and they've taken refuge in the Buddha, and they're practicing his teaching.
Well, I can leave the scientists out of it. The reason I raised Plato in the first place is because he shared the belief in rebirth was extremely common at the time. You look in the index of a complete Plato and you'll find, like 20 references to reincarnation and rebirth and so on. And so it's not that he was denying that belief. It was that he was assuming that desire was a negative thing. It was an absence. And so he didn't have the tendency to see desire as productive of an existing thing, which the Buddha had. It made the contrary assumption about the nature of desire. And that's what intrigues me.
Okay, I think I'll have to give some other people a chance to. What is your name? Mike, okay.
Thank you.
Are you coming from New Jersey?
Yes.
Oh, okay, now I know.
Yes. And at the climate marches, I met you again. You gave me this book many, many years ago. I've observed in this sutta that throughout the Buddha talks about the perception of people, the perception of force, the perception of earth, until we get to the signless concentration of mind. At that point, he drops the word perception.
That's a good point.
And it's always stuck out for me when I read this, because if you define perception, it's being aware of something through the senses, or it's even just a bare awareness, textbook definition. But I also look at perception as having a bias behind it, having an opinion. Like my perception of Earth could be very different than what your perception of Earth would be. And I just always found it curious when I study this sutta, how that word perception disappears right at the end when he's talking about becoming an arahant. Except for leaving the 6 sense bases behind, which, as you had just stated, we're beings in a body. We're going to be this way until we move on to another form.
I think the reason is that in the case of the other experiences which are being discussed, what is being focused upon is okay, it's a perception because it's a perception of some object. And so it's, okay, we're moving from perception of, okay, people, perception of village, perception of earth, then perception of each of the four bases. Okay, so it's perception relating to an object. In this case, when we come to the signless concentration of mind, that is itself, it's a mental state rather than an object. And so it's not the perception of that mental state which is to be considered, for example, as impermanent, as conditioned, volitionally produced, and therefore impermanent and subject to cessation. But it's the attainment itself which is to be viewed from that perspective. Do you get the difference?
It seems like a pretty radical shift to
Yeah,
go
there
from
is
something external to all of a sudden now it's within
Yeah.
yourself and you're looking at yourself. And like
Yeah.
you said, you turn the awareness around.
Yeah.
But it always seemed very significant to me
Yeah.
in concentration meditation is to see if, when something like that starts to occur.
Yeah. I mean, well, that's definitely intended here, in that there is an intentional shift away from focus upon the object of perception. And so what one is doing in the earlier stages is continually refining the perception, because one is taking continuous or successively subtler and more refined objects of perception. But in the last stage, or the last contemplation, one is turning from the object of perception to the mental state. What? To the put it that way, to the subjective state, which is, and it's a signless meditative concentration. So in a sense, because it's signless, the object is probably attenuated to the point where it's nothing clearly visible in itself.
Is when I look at perception as being, say, I perceive something differently than you do,
Yeah.
would that be an accurate way to look at perception, the way the Buddha used it? Because it's used so many times. It's used in the 5 aggregates. It's used in many suttas. And I just see it as a recurring word that I've always wanted to clarify the definition for.
Yeah, there are actually, there are different ways in which the texts treat perception. Okay, the simplest way is in terms of the object, the perception of visible forms, perception of sounds, odors, taste, touch sensations, mental objects. So that's simply differentiated according to the object. But there are also ways of classifying perception according to, maybe call it the subjective tone of the perception.
Right.
And so the Buddha speaks sometimes of wise perception or wholesome perception,
Right.
and then sometimes of unwholesome perception. So the unwholesome perception would be perception which is sort of tinged with desire, in the sense of craving, perception tinged with ill will, and perception tinged with harmfulness, with the intention of harming others. And then the 3 sort of contrasting perceptions are the perception of desirelessness or renunciation, perception of goodwill, perception of non-harming. So that's just one way in which perception is divided up. But then there are some suttas which speak about perception as being like a mirage, which compares, these would be the deluded perceptions. And then it uses the exact, in our experience, sometimes when driving along a road on a dry day when the sun is very strong, we see a pool of water, what seems to be a pool of water on the road, but when we come close to it, it disappears. So that would be like an illusory perception. The object is like a mirage. And so there are a number of suttas which speak about how distorted concepts arise on the foundation of perception.
Yeah, very good. Thank
But
you.
perception also has to be used. It's also said that perception, this would be like the wise perception is the basis for developing mindfulness and insight. So perception can cut either way.
Yeah.
Okay, I think Osmond had his hand up in the back.
Yeah, it seems like the Buddha was following the four arupa jhanas, and then he went to like the ninth jhana, which is the cessation of perception and feeling, and maybe that's why he left out perception.
Yeah, that actually brings up an important point. It's good that you brought that up. That this state called the signless concentration of mind is not the same as the cessation of perception and feeling. In the cessation of perception and feeling, well, we come across this. What could lead one to confuse them is that both come after the attainment of the base of neither perception nor non-perception. But the cessation of perception and feeling is never called a samadhi. And it wouldn't be called ceto samadhi, a concentration of mind, because within that attainment, the perception and feeling are absent. But this is a meditative state in which awareness or consciousness is present. It's not, I have to say, it's not clarified within the suttas exactly what's meant by the signless concentration of mind. That's why I had to bring in what the commentary explains it as the concentration associated with insight into impermanence. But, it seems pretty clear to me that it's not the same as the cessation of perception and feeling, but it's a distinct meditative state. And the two get confused, I believe, in the Chinese translations, because the word that's translated as that nimitta is the Chinese character is xiang.
Xiang.
Yeah. Wait, something is missing here. I saw it in my mind's eye. Right, this. No, not yet. That's where the confusion comes in.
Right.
That's where the confusion comes in. You see, this is pronounced. I've seen it both with the first tone and the fourth tone. Yeah, I've seen it in both ways. Xiang. Yeah. Okay. So this equals nimitta. And so animitta is, do I dare try wuxiang? It's something like,
you can use the simplified one.
What is it, something like?
Very close.
Very close.
Okay, wuxiang, that's animitta. Then, for some reason, for the word sanya, which is completely different in Pali, it comes out in Chinese. xiang. Yeah. Yeah, so the translators, where they should have used wu xiang, instead they used wu xiang, meaning non-perception. So where they should have had signless, they use wu xiang, non-perception, and in that way they mixed up the meditation, the concentration, the signless concentration with the non-perception concentration, or with the non-perception attainment. Okay, any further questions?
Necessary evil. Necessary evil.
What's-
Translation is a necessary evil.
It's not necessarily evil, but there's room for mistakes and confusion.
Bhante, I just had a much easier question for you to answer. The punabhava, the again existence, what is the difference between that and samsara? I always thought it was the same
They're
thing.
pretty much the same, except maybe samsara just suggests the length of it, going on and on and on, whereas punabhava just puts the emphasis on the repetition of it. But in effect, they are the two terms for the same thing. Okay. Okay.
I'll do a little bit translate that. Question number one is basically ask why Buddha go through from to formless state of meditation, because it's not required. Even with form third jhana, they can still reach liberation.
I think he's just trying to show the successive stages and the refinement of emptiness. So to be complete, he has to bring in the formless meditations.
And that's actually, this is another question is basically is asking what is the lowest jhana is required to achieve liberation.
That question isn't related to the sutta, so I'm not going to answer. Okay, well, if there's one more question, then I'll answer. Then we have to stop because there's another group coming in here.
Bhante, what is nimitta? Since there's wu xiang, then can you please explain?
What is the nimitta here?
Yeah. What is sign? Then signless, right? And what is the sign?
Yeah. Here the word nimitta is being used differently than it comes to be used within the work like Visuddhimagga and the commentaries, where nimitta is used to represent the inwardly visualized object of meditation. What is meant by nimitta here, it's never explained in the suttas themselves, but again, this is what the commentary says in this case, that it's the appearance of stability, solidity, or permanence in conditioned phenomena. And so when one is develops the perception of impermanence, or the contemplation of impermanence deeply enough, then it removes that appearance of solidity or stability in phenomena. So nimitta would be, in that case, the appearance of stability, solidity, or lastingness in phenomena. Okay, we have to end for the day, so again, we'll end with 3 half bows to the Buddha. Okay, thank you all for coming.